Caleb Walker slammed $20 on that filthy counter without blinking. Not because he was kind. Not because he was brave. But because he couldn't stand one more second watching a man sell a woman like she was livestock. The crowd went quiet. Amos's eyes narrowed. And then she looked up at him, not with gratitude, not with relief, but with something worse. She looked at him like she was already calculating the price she'd have to pay later. That look nearly stopped his heart cold. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe, drop your city in the comments, and stay with me until the very end. The trading post at Oak Haven sat at the junction of two dirt trails that didn't lead anywhere worth going, and that was precisely why men like Amos Greer made their business there. Caleb Walker had ridden into Oak Haven for salt-dried beans and nothing else. He was 3 days out from his ridge cabin. His horse was tired, and the sun had been hammering the back of his neck since before noon. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble. He wasn't a man who looked for much of anything beyond what the next stretch of mountain trail required. He tied his horse outside the post, pulled his hat lower against the glare, and pushed through the door. The smell hit him first. Unwashed men, cheap tobacco, sawdust, soaked through with whiskey, and something sharper underneath. The post was crowded for a Tuesday. Miners, mostly a few ranch hands, 2 men in the corner who had the flat-eyed look of men hired specifically to stand in corners. Caleb moved to the supply counter along the far wall, nodded at the storekeeper, and started working through his list in his head. That was when he heard the voice. $20. That's my final offer, and you're lucky I'm being generous. The voice belonged to Amos Greer. Caleb knew it without turning around. The way you know a rattlesnake by its sound before you see it. Amos had a voice like gravel dragged across a tin roof, loud by nature, louder when he wanted witnesses. Caleb turned slowly. Amos stood near the center of the room, with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his boots planted wide. He was a big man running to fat now that he was past 40, with a red face and pale eyes that didn't match. Behind him stood 2 men. Caleb didn't recognize, both armed, both deliberately relaxed in the way that meant they were paid to look that way. And in front of Amos, slightly to the side, stood a young woman. She was maybe 25. Brown hair pulled back without care, strands of it stuck to the side of her face in the heat. She was wearing a gray-brown dress that had been washed so many times. The original color was anybody's guess, and an apron that had seen harder work than most men in that room. She was not small. She was built the way frontier women sometimes were, solid and real, the kind of body that had actually worked for its living. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her eyes were fixed on a point on the floorboards about 3 feet ahead of her boots. There were bruises on her forearms, not old ones. Caleb looked at the storekeeper. The storekeeper was very busy counting nails. $20, Amos said again, louder this time, turning slightly to play to the room. Woman can cook, clean, haul water. Strong back. No complaints. He paused. Well, she complains some, but you can cure that. A few men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The woman, she didn't flinch at the laughter. That was the thing Caleb noticed. She'd already made herself somewhere else. He'd seen that look before on men who'd been through things they hadn't come back from all the way. The body stays. Something else goes somewhere quieter and waits. Caleb looked back at his list. Salt. Beans. He stood there for a moment that was probably 3 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then he turned around, walked across the room, and stopped about 4 feet from Amos Greer. Who she belonged to, Caleb said. Amos looked him over with the careful assessment of a man who has sized up trouble before and mostly come out ahead. He saw a lean man, maybe 35, trail-worn, dark-eyed under the hat brim. Not large. Not particularly threatening at first glance. But there was something about the stillness of him that made Amos take just a half-second longer than he wanted to. She worked off a debt of mine, Amos said. Now she's done working it off, and I'm recouping my investment. You interested, or are you just browsing? $20, Caleb said. Amos blinked. That's what I said. I'm not haggling, Caleb said. I'm paying it. Where do I give the money? The room shifted, not loudly, but the way a room shifts when something unexpected has entered it. Caleb didn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes on Amos. Amos's pale eyes moved between Caleb and the woman and back again. His expression cycled through surprised, suspicious, and then landed on something smug, because $20 was $20, and he hadn't expected to get it this fast. "Right here's fine," Amos said, and held out his hand. Caleb counted out the bills from the inside pocket of his vest. He'd planned to use that money for winter stores, and some part of his mind registered this with grim practicality and placed them in Amos's palm without touching the man's hand if he could help it. Amos counted them twice, nodded. "She's all yours," he said, and stepped aside with the theatrical good humor of a man who's just won something he didn't deserve. Caleb turned to the woman. She was looking at him now, not at the floor anymore. Her eyes were gray-green, which he hadn't expected, and they were doing something complicated that he couldn't fully read. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was a kind of rapid, precise calculation, the look of someone assessing new danger while the old danger was still in the room. "Ma'am," Caleb said, "I'm going to walk outside now. You can come with me, or you can stay here. That's up to you." Something moved across her face, just for a moment. "I'll come," she said. Her voice was low and steady, and didn't ask for anything. He nodded once and walked back toward the door. He heard her footsteps behind him a half-beat after his. Not following, keeping pace. Outside the heat was immediate and total. The sun had moved enough that it was coming in at a lower angle, cutting hard shadows across the trail. Caleb untied his horse, checked the saddlebags by habit, and then stood for a moment without turning around. "I don't know your name," he said. "Clara," she said. "Clara Harper." "Caleb Walker." He still didn't turn around. "I have a cabin about 3 days' ride northeast, up the ridge. It's not much, but it's away from here, and Amos Greer doesn't know where it is." He paused. "I'm not buying anything from you, Miss Harper. I want to be straight about that before we go any further." Silence. He turned around then because he needed to see her face when she answered. She was standing very straight. Her hands were at her sides now instead of clasped in front of her. Her eyes were still doing that calculating thing, but it had slowed down some. "What do you want then?" she said. It was a fair question. He respected it. "Nothing," he said. "I saw something that needed stopping. I stopped it. That's all." "Men don't do things for nothing," Clara said. Not angry, not accusing. Just a statement of fact, delivered the way you'd state that the sun rose east. "No," Caleb agreed. "Most don't." She looked at him for a long moment. "I can cook," she said finally. "And I can work. I don't need to be carried." "I didn't figure you did." "And I don't—" She stopped, started again. "I won't be another stop." "I heard you," Caleb said quietly. "I understood you the first time." The calculation in her eyes shifted into something that wasn't quite trust, and wasn't quite relief, and was maybe the very early beginning of one of those things too small to name yet. "All right," she said. He handed her his canteen. "Drink. It's 3 days of trail. Your feet are going to need better wrapping than what you've got." She took the canteen. She drank without making it a big thing. Then she handed it back. "I've walked worse," she said. "Probably," he said. They didn't say much for the first several hours. Caleb led the horse and Clara walked beside him, not behind which he noticed, but didn't remark on. The trail out of Oak Haven climbed steadily, trading the flatland dust for the thin-aired scrub of the lower ridge country. The sun tracked west. The heat didn't break, but it changed character, drier, sharper, with a faint smell of pine resin coming down off the higher slopes. She didn't complain. Not about the heat. Not about the terrain, not about the pace. Her feet wrapped in rough cloth that wasn't doing much had to be killing her by mile 2, and she walked like they weren't. Around mid-afternoon, Caleb stopped to water the horse at a creek that had shrunk to its summer self, barely more than a trickle over pale rocks. "Sit," he said. "I'm fine." "Sit anyway," he said. "I need to check the horse's shoe, and it'll take a minute." She sat on a rock near the creek and took off one of her cloth wrappings and held her foot in the water and didn't say anything while he pretended to check the shoe. After a moment she said, You know the horse is fine. The rock's better than standing, he said. She put her foot back in the water and was quiet for another minute. How long have you been up on that ridge? She said. 6 years. Alone? Yes. By choice. He looked up at her. By choice. She absorbed this. And you rode 3 days down into Oakhaven for supplies. Salt and beans, he said. And you spent your supply money on me instead. I spent it on something that needed doing, he said. I'll get by. She was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, less guarded, more thinking. Back there, she said. When you told me I could stay or come, did you mean it? Yes. If I'd stayed, you would have just left. Would have been your choice, he said. Not mine to override. She looked down at her foot in the water. The bruises on her forearms caught the afternoon light, and he made himself look away. I've met men who said things like that before, she said. They generally didn't mean them. I can't speak for other men, Caleb said. No, she said. I suppose you can't. The horse snorted softly. Caleb brushed the dust off his knees and went to his saddlebag. He pulled out a strip of clean cloth he kept several for field bandaging and held it out to her. She looked at it. For your feet, he said. Better than what you've got. She took it. She wrapped her foot herself without asking for help, and did it efficiently the way someone who's been handling their own problems for a long time handles their own problems. Thank you, she said. He nodded and started walking again. They made camp before dark in a hollow off the trail where 2 boulders created a natural windbreak. Caleb got a fire going, small, practical, no bigger than necessary, and put water on to boil. He had jerky and hardtack and dried apricots, which was not a generous supper, and he divided it evenly without discussion. Clara sat across the fire from him. She ate without ceremony. When she was done, she sat with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and watched the fire with the settled stillness of someone who has spent time outdoors, whether they chose to or not. How did you end up with Amos Greer? Caleb said. He hadn't planned to ask it. He generally didn't ask questions that weren't his business. She didn't answer right away. The fire crackled. A nightbird called once far off. My father owed him money, she said. When my father died, Amos said the debt transferred to me. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have anyone to say otherwise. She paused. So I worked. He kept adding to the debt. That's how men like Amos work. The debt never quite reaches zero. No, Caleb said. It doesn't. You knew men like him. I've known men like him. She watched him across the fire. What made you stop in there? You could have just bought your salt. The question sat in the air between them. Caleb thought about lying, not a big lie, just the comfortable kind of half-answer that closed conversations. He was good at those. You weren't asking for help, he said instead. That's what did it. Most people in a bad spot are looking for someone to notice. You weren't. You'd already decided nobody was going to. He picked up a stick and turned it in the fire. I've been that person. It's a hard place to be. Clara was very still. That's a strange thing to admit, she said quietly. Probably, he said. She looked back at the fire. After a long moment, she said, I wasn't going to make it much longer with him. You should know that. Not because I wanted you to feel like you saved me. Just because it's true, and I don't like owing a debt based on a lie. You don't owe me a debt, Caleb said. I know that's what you think, she said. But I'll decide what I owe. He looked at her, then really looked past the bruises and the worn dress and the wariness, and saw what was underneath it. Something iron-spined and precise, with the kind of quiet pride that doesn't bend easy, and has probably been bent before, and straightened itself out in the dark without anybody watching. Fair enough, he said. They let the fire burn down. Caleb settled on his bedroll, and Clara arranged herself on the other side of the dead fire space, with the blanket he'd given her facing away, and they lay there in the dark, with the ridge wind moving through the scrub above them. After a long time, when he was almost asleep, she spoke. Mr. Walker. Caleb's fine. A pause. Caleb. Her voice was very quiet. What happens when we get to your cabin? He stared up at the stars for a moment. "You rest," he said. "Then you figure out what you want to do next, and nobody tells you what that is." Silence. "All right," she said. "Just that." He closed his eyes. The fire was out. The ridge was dark and wide, and the night smelled of dry pine and hot rock cooling, and the very distant suggestion of a summer storm, still days away. Below them, Oak Haven sat in its own dust and its own meanness, and Amos Greer was already deciding something. Caleb could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds show, but that was a problem for the trail. Right now, in this moment, there was a woman on the other side of the dead fire who was breathing slow and even not yet asleep, and a man on his back staring at the Milky Way and trying to remember the last time another person's breathing had been close enough to hear. 6 years was a long time. He didn't know what any of this was going to cost him yet. He knew it was going to cost something. The second morning came hard and fast, the way mornings do on the high ridge, when the sun clears the eastern peaks all at once and turns the air from cool to brutal in about 20 minutes flat. Caleb was already up. He'd been up since before first light, old habit, the kind that sticks when you've lived alone long enough that sleep starts feeling like a calculated risk. He had water boiling by the time Clara stirred, and he kept his back to her while she got herself together, because he figured that was the decent thing to do, and also because he didn't know what to do with his face in the morning, and it was easier not to test it. "You sleep," he said without turning around. "Some," she said. "That's enough." He heard her moving behind him, the quiet sounds of someone trying not to take up too much space. After a minute, she came and crouched beside the small fire and held her hands near the heat, and he poured water into the tin cup and handed it to her without making a ceremony of it. She took it, wrapped both hands around it. Didn't say thank you this time, which he found he respected more than when she had. They broke camp in about 10 minutes. Clara rolled the blanket the same way he did, tight and fast, and tied it without being shown. She laced her re-wrapped feet with the efficiency of someone who has learned to be their own nurse, and she stood up straight and looked down the trail without asking which direction. He pointed northeast. She started walking. He followed with the horse. That was the second day. It should have been quiet. It mostly was. But quiet with two people is a different animal than quiet alone. And Caleb kept noticing things he hadn't expected to notice, the way she cataloged the terrain as she walked. Her eyes moving along the ridgeline methodically, not with fear, but with the careful attention of someone building a map in her head. The way she adjusted her pace over rough ground without breaking stride, almost like she'd done trail work before. The way she never once asked how much farther. Around mid-morning he said, "You've traveled before." "Some," she said. "Where Missouri first, then Kansas, then west." A pause. "My father moved us every time a town stopped working out for him." What kind of man was he? She walked 3 steps before she answered. "The kind that meant well and caused harm anyway," she said. "Which might be the worst kind, because at least the ones who don't mean well can't disappoint you as deeply." Caleb thought about that for a long moment. "That's a precise way to put it," he said. "I've had time to think about it," she said. He almost smiled. He stopped himself before it got too far. By noon the trail had narrowed and steepened, and Caleb took the horse's lead in both hands and picked the line carefully. Clara stayed slightly behind him now, not because she was following, but because the path demanded single file, and she navigated the loose shale with a flat-footed sureness that surprised him. Then she slipped. Not badly, just a skid. Her right foot going out from under her on a patch of loose gravel, but she went down on one knee, and her hands hit the rock, and Caleb turned so fast the horse shied. He had his hand out before he thought about it. She looked at his hand for exactly 1 second. Then she took it, let him pull her up, and dropped it the moment she was standing. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't need." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes doing their reading thing, and whatever she was measuring, she seemed to decide she hadn't figured it out yet, and looked back at the trail instead. "Thank you," she said to the trail, not to him. "Anytime," he said to the horse, not to her. They kept walking. That was the first mini-climax of the day, small and ordinary, and over in 15 seconds. But it sat between them for another hour. The fact of his hand, the fact of hers taking it, the fact that neither of them had mentioned it after. The second came at the creek crossing in mid-afternoon. The creek was running low for summer, maybe knee-deep at its deepest point, but the bottom was slick, and the banks were steeper than they looked from a distance. Caleb crossed first with the horse picked the line turned around on the far bank. Clara stood on the near bank and looked at the crossing with a face that said she was doing math she didn't like the answer to. "Current's not bad," Caleb said. "It's the rocks on the bottom." "I can see that," she said. "You want—" "No," she said before he finished the offer. "All right," he said. She stepped in. The cold hit her, he could see it in the sharp pull of her breath, and she took the first 3 steps well, reading the current, finding the flat spots. Then her wrapped foot found a round rock, and her weight shifted wrong, and she lurched sideways, arms out. Caleb was already in the water. He got his arm around her before she went down, one solid forearm across her back, and held her upright while she found her footing. The water came up to his shins. He didn't move until she nodded, and even then he held position just long enough to make sure she had it. She found solid ground. Walked the rest of the crossing without trouble. On the far bank she stood and caught her breath, and looked back at the creek, and then at him, and he could see her getting ready to say something about it. Something sharp and self-sufficient and proud, and he beat her to it. "You had the first half fine," he said. "It was the one rock." Something moved in her expression. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something softer and faster that she put away before he could identify it. "One rock," she agreed. They moved on. By the time they made camp the second night, something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not the way it shifts in the stories men tell about women and wilderness. Subtler than that. The shift that happens when 2 people have handled 2 difficult things in one day, and neither of them has made it into something it wasn't. Clara helped set the camp without being asked. Not helping exactly, more like working a parallel track, efficient and self-directed. While he tended the horse, she gathered the driest wood in the area and had a fire going by the time he came back. When he pulled out the food, she took half of it and started organizing it by what cooked fastest, and he let her because she clearly knew what she was doing and because watching her work was unexpectedly interesting. "You were a cook," he said. "I was a lot of things," she said, "but cook specifically." She looked up. "How'd you know?" "The way you sorted the food. That's a professional habit." She was quiet for a moment. "I worked in a hotel kitchen in Kansas City. Before my father got sick. Before—" She stopped, started again. "Before things changed." "You liked it." Something genuinely surprised moved through her expression, like the question had caught her somewhere, unguarded. "I did," she said, and then seemed almost annoyed at herself for the admission. There was an order to it. You knew what a good meal was supposed to taste like, and you either achieved it or you didn't, and nobody could argue with the result. "Unlike most things," he said. "Unlike most things," she agreed. The food was simple, but she made it better than it had any right to be, coaxing something almost decent out of the dried meat and the hard biscuits he had left. He ate all of it without saying so, but she noticed he could tell from the slight ease in her shoulders when his plate came back empty. Afterward, she sat by the fire and looked into it, and Caleb sat on the other side and was quiet with her, and neither of them felt the need to fill the air. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," he said. "Why did you really leave 6 years ago? What made you come up to that ridge and stay?" The fire popped. Somewhere up the slope an owl called clean and far. "I was a deputy," Caleb said, "in a town called Red Hook about 40 miles east of here." He paused. "I did my job for 5 years. Kept order. Brought men in. Followed the law. And then one day the man I worked for, the sheriff, decided the law was less useful than the money being offered by the railroad. And I found out." Another pause longer. "And he knew I found out." Clara was watching him without speaking. "I left," Caleb said, "because staying would have meant becoming something I couldn't live being, or dying before I had to." He looked at the fire. "I chose the ridge." "Do you regret it?" she said. "Every single day," he said, "and not at all, depending on the hour." She absorbed this. Then quietly, "The men in that town in Red Hook, what happened to them?" "They got what they were after," Caleb said. For a while. He picked up a stick and turned it in the flames. Railroad came through, then left. Then the town dried up. That's what railroads do. He put the stick down. The sheriff died broke. I heard that from a trader 2 winters ago. Good, Clara said. Just that. One word, flat and certain. He looked at her. She met his gaze without apology. Good, she said again, quieter. He nodded once. Yeah, he said. I thought so too. The third day started before dawn, because Caleb wanted to make the upper ridge by midday, and the last stretch was the worst. He shook her shoulder once, gently standing back as he did it, because he'd noticed she slept like someone ready to come awake fast, and he was right. She was sitting up before the sound of his voice had finished. 2 more hours of good trail, he said. Then it gets steep. I'm ready, she said. No complaint. No ceremony. They moved in the gray pre-dawn light, the horse quiet and cooperative, Clara finding her stride faster today than the days before. Her feet had to be better with the proper wrapping, though she'd never said so. He'd checked the cloth when she was asleep the second night, not to invade anything, just because infected feet on the ridge trail were a problem he could prevent, and the wrapping had held clean. She'd done it right. She was doing a lot of things right, and he was running out of ways to be unsurprised by it. They hit the steep section around mid-morning, and Caleb went first, working the horse up the switchbacks, carefully calling back the bad spots without making it a lesson. Clara came up behind him with one hand on the rock face for balance, navigating the loose sections with a low center of gravity and a patience that didn't look like patience, it looked like decision-making. Every step a choice, not a struggle. Halfway up she stopped. He heard it. The silence where her footsteps should have been, and turned. She was standing on a narrow ledge looking east, and her face had gone very still. What is it? He said. She pointed. Below them and to the east, where the trail dropped back toward the valley, 2 riders were moving. They were too far to see clearly, but not too far to read the direction they were traveling. Northeast. The same heading. How many people know this trail? Clara said. Caleb's jaw tightened. Not many, he said. But Amos has been up this country before. He'll know where you're going. He might. Caleb watched the riders for another few seconds. Or he might be going somewhere else entirely. He turned back to the trail. Either way, we move faster. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She just started climbing. That was the third mini-climax, and it changed the air between them in a way the creek and the rock hadn't, because this wasn't about terrain or balance. This was about threat, and threat has a way of clarifying things that comfort never quite manages. They reached the upper ridge in just under an hour, moving faster than Caleb had planned, and harder than he'd wanted to push her. And he watched her arrive at the top, breathing hard but steady, her jaw set, her eyes moving immediately to check the rider's last known position. Gone, he said. Lost them when we came over the ridgeline. That doesn't mean they're not still coming, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She turned from the view and looked at him with a directness that he still hadn't quite adjusted to. If it's Amos, she said, he's not coming because of the $20. $20 isn't worth 3 days of riding. She paused. He's coming because I know something. Caleb went still. What do you know? He said. Clara held his gaze. When I was working for him, she said slowly, I cleaned his office, every morning. Men don't think a woman cleaning an office is paying attention. She paused. I was paying attention. Amos and 2 other men, a man named Silas Holt and a man from the land office, they've been filing false claims. Homestead land along the Southwater Corridor. Forging signatures on the paperwork registering the plots under dead men's names. There are 12 claims, maybe 15. The land's worth... She stopped. Did the math behind her eyes. It's worth thousands, once the railroad comes through. The silence after she finished was the specific silence of a man recalibrating. And you have proof, Caleb said, not a question. I have specific names, dates, and plot numbers, she said. I memorized them. I couldn't take the papers, he would have noticed, but I have them up here. She touched her temple. Every one. Caleb stood very still for a long moment. "You understand," he said carefully, "that this is not a small thing you're carrying." "Yes," she said, "and you understand that Amos Greer is not going to let that go." "Yes," she said again. "I know exactly what I'm carrying. I've known since before you walked into that trading post." Her voice was steady and clear and held something underneath it, something that had been there since the beginning, underneath the wariness, underneath the calculation. Not fear. The opposite of fear. "I just needed to get far enough away to decide what to do with it." He looked at her, this woman with the bruises on her arms and the worn-out shoes and the iron spine and the memory full of stolen names and forged numbers, and felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years of living on a ridge above the world. He felt like the situation required him. "All right," he said. His voice was quiet, but it wasn't soft. "Let's get to the cabin." She nodded. "And Clara." She looked at him. "Whatever you decide to do with what you know," he said, "you're not doing it alone." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the ridge hot and dry, carrying pine and dust, and the far smell of the summer heat rising off the valley below. "You don't even know me," she said. "I know enough," he said. She looked at him one more second. Then she turned and walked toward the cabin, and the set of her shoulders was different than it had been at the bottom of the trail. Still straight, still precise. But something had come unclenched in it, just slightly, just enough. Caleb stood at the ridgetop for one more moment, looking east where the riders had been. The valley was empty and still and golden, with the midday glare, and whatever was moving through it was moving below the line of sight now, patient and unseen. He turned and followed her. The cabin came into view around the last bend. Low-roofed, solid-built, the kind of structure that announces it has survived things through sheer refusal to cooperate with weather. Clara stopped when she saw it, and stood looking at it for a moment, and he stopped beside her and waited. "It's real," she said almost to herself. "What did you think it was?" She shook her head slightly. "I didn't know what to think," she said honestly. "I still don't know what to think." "That's fair," he said. "You don't have to yet." She exhaled not a sigh more, like a pressure releasing, and walked the last 100 yards to the door. He came behind her and reached past her to unlatch it. And when she stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the room and looked around at the spare clean order of the place, the single table, the 2 chairs, the shelves of provisions, the stone fireplace, the narrow bed along the back wall, he watched her face and saw something happen there that was private and real, and that he looked away from because it wasn't his to witness. He set his saddlebags down by the door. "The bed's yours," he said. "I sleep fine by the fire." She started to object. He kept talking. "I've slept by that fire for 6 years," he said. "It's actually where I sleep better, so don't argue with me about it." She closed her mouth. "There are provisions on the left shelf," he said. "Use whatever you need. Water barrels outside the east wall. I'll fill it tomorrow from the upper spring." He paused. "Rest today. Tomorrow you can tell me everything you remember, and we'll figure out what to do with it." Clara turned from the shelf she'd been examining and looked at him with an expression he still couldn't fully categorize. It had too many layers, and they were all moving at slightly different speeds. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Really. Not the version you told me on the trail. The real one." He thought about lying. He thought about a half-truth. He thought about the easy deflection, the kind that closes conversations. He said, "Because I left a town once when I should have stayed. And it's sat with me every day since, and today I didn't leave." He held her gaze. "That's the real version." The fire was unlit. The room was warm anyway. Outside the ridge, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. Clara Harper stood in the middle of a stranger's cabin at the end of 3 days of trail, with bruises on her arms and the names of 15 stolen land claims locked in her memory, and 2 riders somewhere in the valley below who were almost certainly not going to stop riding. She stood there and looked at the man who had paid $20 for a principal and carried it for 60 miles, and she said the only true thing she had left. "I don't know how to trust people," she said. "I don't think I've known for a long time." "I know," he said, "but I'm going to try." She said it like a decision, not a hope. Like something she'd measured and chosen. So don't make me regret it. I won't, Caleb said. He meant it the way men mean things when they're saying them to the only person in 100 miles who is listening. She nodded. She sat down in one of the chairs. She put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes, and in 60 seconds she was asleep. The deep, sudden sleep of someone whose body has been waiting for permission to stop. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked east. The valley was still. The sky was wide and pale with afternoon heat. Somewhere below, two riders were measuring distance and deciding things. He turned away from the view and quietly put water on to boil. Whatever was coming, it wasn't here yet. He intended to use every hour he had. She slept for 4 hours. Caleb knew, because he tracked the light through the single window, the way men do when they have nothing to do but wait and too much to think about, to waste the time on sleeping. The water he'd boiled had cooled and been reheated twice. He'd checked the horse, repacked the saddlebags, gone through the provision shelf, and taken quiet inventory, and done a long, slow circuit of the cabin's exterior. Reading the ground the way 6 years of ridge living had taught him to read it. No tracks but his own. Not yet. When Clara woke, it was the same way she'd come awake on the trail, fast and complete, no drowsy middle ground. She was upright before he'd moved from his chair, and her eyes were clear and immediate, and already calculating. How long? She said. Few hours, he said. You needed it. She looked like she was going to argue, then looked at her hands, instead flexed them once, and let it go. You should have woken me. No reason to, he said. Nothing's moved on the eastern trail. She absorbed this, stood up, moved to the water basin on the shelf, and washed her face with a practicality that had no self-consciousness in it, dried her hands on the cloth beside it, and turned around. All right, she said. Tell me what you're thinking. He liked that she said that first. Not asking him to decide, asking him to think out loud. There was a difference. I'm thinking, he said, that if those riders were Amos and Silas, they'll reach the lower ridge trail by tomorrow morning at the earliest. The upper switchbacks are hard to find if you don't know them. That buys us time. He paused. But not much. Then we need to move first, she said. Or we need to make moving unnecessary, he said. She looked at him steadily. You mean the land claims? I mean the land claims, he said. If what you know gets to the right person before Amos gets to us, he doesn't have a reason to come up here anymore. He has a reason to run. Clara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and precise, the way it got when she was working something through. The nearest federal land office is in Harrow City, 2 days' ride south. I know it. If we ride together, we leave the cabin empty. He gets here, he knows we went for help. He could ride faster, cut us off on the south trail. She paused. If I ride alone, I'm one woman with information and no corroborating witness. They may not take me seriously. They won't, Caleb said flatly. Not without a witness or documentation. So we need the papers, she said. Caleb went still. The original papers, Clara said. Or copies. Something that ties the names and plot numbers to Amos directly. Something I can't have memorized wrong or invented. She met his gaze. I know where he keeps them. In his office back in Oak Haven. The locked drawer on the left side of his desk. The keys on his watch chain. You want to go back to Oak Haven, Caleb said. I want you to go back to Oak Haven, she said. The silence in the cabin was of the specific quality that follows a statement that reorganizes a room. You're serious, he said. You can move faster alone, she said. You know the trails. He doesn't know you came up here for anything but supplies. He thinks you're just a man who paid $20 for a woman, which means he's not watching for you specifically. Her voice was level. If you go back, get into his office, get those papers, and ride south, I'll stay here. I can manage the cabin. If riders come up the trail, I'll hear them before they reach the door. And then what? Caleb said. You hear them coming. Then what? She looked at him without blinking. Then I deal with it. With what? With whatever you leave me, she said. I assume you have more than one gun. He stood up from the chair. Not in anger, just because something about the conversation required him to be standing. He walked to the window, looked east at nothing, and turned back around. "You're asking me to leave you alone on a ridge with Amos Greer potentially a day behind you," he said. "With a gun you may or may not know how to use." "I know how to use a gun," Clara said. "My father wasn't completely useless. He taught me that much." "One lesson." "More than one," she said, and the steadiness in her voice told him it was true. "I'm not asking you to trust that I'm an expert. I'm asking you to trust that I'll do what needs doing." She stepped toward him, not close just enough to make the conversation direct. "Caleb, this is the only way that works. You know it is. You're just arguing because you don't like leaving me here." He looked at her. "You're right," he said. "I don't." Something quick and warm moved through her expression and was gone. "That's—" She stopped, recalibrated. "That means something. It does. But it can't change the math." He hated that she was right. He'd hated it since she started talking, and he could see the logic assembling itself with the same clean efficiency she brought to everything else. "If I'm not back in 4 days," he said, "you ride south. Don't wait. Don't give anyone the benefit of the doubt." 4 days, she said. "Take the horse." "You need the horse." "I'll take the horse to Oak Haven and leave it with the livery there. They know me. I'll come back on foot if I have to." He paused. "But I won't have to. I'll be back in 3. She held his gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then she nodded. Once. Final. He went to the cabinet along the back wall and took out the second revolver, older than his heavier, but reliable. He checked the cylinder, loaded it full, and held it out to her. She took it. Checked the cylinder herself. He watched her do it and felt something settle. "You do know how to use it," he said. "I told you," she said. He reached back into the cabinet and put a box of cartridges on the table beside her. Then he stood for a moment, looking at the table, not at her, because there were things pressing at the inside of his chest, and he wasn't in the habit of letting them out, and this was not the time to start. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't say anything that makes this harder." He looked at her then. She was looking back at him with her arms at her sides, and the revolver in her right hand, and the gray-green eyes that were doing about 7 things at once, and underneath all the calculation and the steadiness. There was something that looked almost like trust, the new kind, the kind that hasn't been tested yet, but has been decided on. "Bar the door," he said. "Don't open it for anyone until you've verified who's out there." "I know." "No," she said. "The spring's up the slope northeast. There's a marked trail." "I know," she said again. "You told me." "I'll be back," he said. She nodded. Not like she believed it automatically. Like she'd chosen to. He left before something shifted in his chest cracked all the way through. The ride back down to Oak Haven was faster alone and uglier. Caleb pushed the horse harder than he liked and kept his mind on the route, and off the cabin, and off the image of Clara Harper, sitting by a cold fireplace with a loaded revolver, and 4 days to wait. He was good at compartmentalizing. 6 years of solitude had made him excellent at it. But compartments have walls, and walls have pressure limits, and his were getting tested. He reached Oak Haven by the next afternoon, rode in from the west to avoid the main trail, and left the horse at the livery with a man named Dort, who asked no questions, because Caleb had always paid on time, and Dort was professionally incurious. Oak Haven in the afternoon heat was half asleep. The trading post was open. 2 horses were tied outside Amos's office, which was the small clapboard building set back behind the post. But the horses were hitched lazily, not ready to ride, which meant Amos wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. Or wasn't there at all. Caleb stood in the shadow of the alley beside the feed store and took stock. 2 horses. Could be Amos and Silas, could be anyone. Could mean they hadn't left yet, which meant they weren't the riders on the northeast trail, or could mean they'd gone and come back faster than expected. His jaw tightened. He needed to know which. He walked into the trading post through the back. The storekeeper, a man named Hooper, owed Caleb a favor from a winter. 3 years back when Caleb had pulled his wagon out of a gully and asked for nothing. Hooper looked up, looked surprised, looked carefully at the door, and then looked back. "Amos been in today," Caleb said low. Hooper shook his head. He and Silas rode out yesterday morning, northeast. He paused. Looking for someone, they said. Caleb's stomach dropped about 2 inches, and he didn't show it. They come back. Not through here. Those horses outside Amos's office. That's Brecker and his boy, land business. They've been waiting on Amos all morning, getting unhappy about it. Hooper paused again. Caleb, whatever you're doing, you might want to do it fast. I intend to, Caleb said. He was in and out of Amos's office in 11 minutes. The lock on the back window was the simple kind, and Caleb had worked harder locks in his deputy years without breaking a sweat. The office was dim and hot, and smelled of tobacco and something slightly rotten underneath, and the desk was exactly where you'd expect a man like Amos to keep his desk center of the room, facing the door, positioned for maximum authority over anyone who entered. Left drawer. Locked. The key wasn't here. Amos had it on his watch chain, Clara had said. But the drawer itself was old, the lock worn, and Caleb had a narrow piece of steel in his vest pocket that he'd carried since his deputy days, for reasons he'd never had to explain to anyone. The lock gave on the second try. Inside, a land map, folded. A ledger, small brown, the kind a man keeps for accounts he can't keep publicly. Letters, 3 of them, tied with a cord. And at the bottom, a stack of filed claim documents copied, not originals, but in Amos's hand with names that matched what Clara had described. 12 claims. The plot numbers she'd memorized were on the page. He took the ledger and the claim copies and left the rest. He locked the drawer back. He went out the window. How was at the livery getting the horse 20 minutes later when he heard the voice. Thought that was your horse. He turned slowly. Silas Holt was standing 10 feet away. He was a narrow man, pale-eyed like Amos, but where Amos ran to bluster, Silas ran to stillness, the specific stillness of someone who has done bad things carefully and plans to keep doing them. He had a gun on his hip, and his hand was near it, but not on it, which meant he was having a conversation, not starting a fight. Yet. Silas, Caleb said. You came back, Silas said. Interesting. Needed to settle up with the livery, Caleb said. I paid short last time. Uh-huh. Silas's pale eyes moved to the saddlebag, the one Caleb had just tucked the ledger and papers into. Amos sent me back for supplies. Said if I happened to see you, I should ask you something. Ask? Caleb said. Where is she? Caleb held the man's gaze without any change in his own. She left, he said. Took her wages and said she was heading east. Didn't tell me where. Uh-huh, Silas said again. The word was doing a lot of work for him. And you rode all the way back down here just to pay the livery. I'm a man who settles his debts, Caleb said. The silence between them had teeth in it. Silas took 1 step forward. Just one. See, Amos has a particular interest in that woman. Something she might have taken with her that wasn't hers to take. His voice was soft. Information's a kind of property, too. You probably knew that, being a former lawman and all. The air in the livery went about 10 degrees colder. Caleb didn't move. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Sure you don't. Silas tilted his head. Here's what I think, Walker. I think you know exactly what she knows. And I think whatever she told you is sitting in that saddlebag right now. He paused. And I think you should give it to me, as a friendly gesture, before this gets unfriendly. Caleb looked at Silas Holt for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, You're alone. Silas smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Amos is a day behind me. Which means you're alone, Caleb said. And you've got 1 gun, and I've got 1 gun, and we're in a man's livery, where Dort over there has a shotgun behind the feed sacks, and would very much like no shooting in his building. So, before you finish the thought you're having, I'd ask you to consider how that particular math works out for you. Silas went very still. Caleb stepped to his horse, put his foot in the stirrup, and mounted without hurrying. Tell us I said hello, he said. And tell him if he's smart, which I've never been sure about, he'll be gone from this county before the end of the month. He rode out of Oak Haven at a controlled pace, because running would invite a bullet and trotting wouldn't, and he kept his back straight and his hands easy on the reins until the buildings dropped behind him and the trail opened up, and then he pushed the horse hard into a gallop and didn't slow down for the better part of an hour. Silas knew. Which meant Amos would know. Which meant the timeline had just collapsed from 4 days to 1. He rode through the cooling afternoon and into the early dark, and stopped only twice to water the horse and check his bearings, and his mind was running the calculations the whole time. How fast Silas could get word to Amos. How fast Amos could push his horse, whether they'd go to the cabin directly or try to cut him off on the trail. Whether Clara had heard anything yet. Whether she was still in the cabin, or whether some version of events had already unfolded on that ridge that he was riding back too late to prevent. He stopped that line of thinking by force and replaced it with trail math and pace calculation, because thinking about what he couldn't control was useless, and he needed everything he had for what he could. Dawn was still a gray smear on the eastern horizon when he hit the lower ridge trail, and he dismounted there and led the horse up on foot, quieter, picking his way in the low light without a lamp. The upper switchbacks. The last bend. And then he stopped. Because there was a sound from inside the cabin. Voices. His hand went to his gun. He moved the last 30 yards in silence, came around the cabin's west wall, and flattened himself beside the door. The voices were clearer now. One he recognized. One he didn't. Clara's voice was steady, controlled. The voice she used when she was running calculations and didn't want anyone to see it. The other voice was Amos Greer. They were already here. Caleb pressed against the door and listened, and what he heard made the blood in his veins do something complicated. "You're a smart woman," Amos was saying, his gravel voice almost friendly. "Almost. I always thought so. That's why I kept you around as long as I did. Smart women are useful." A pause. "Smart women who stop being useful are a different matter." "I don't have anything of yours," Clara said. "Then you won't mind if Silas looks around." "Silas isn't here," Clara said. "It's just you." A beat of silence. "That's true," Amos said, and his voice dropped into something colder. "Which means this is a private conversation. No witnesses." Caleb tried the door handle. Barred from inside. He moved to the window on the east side, checked the shutter, she'd latched it, but the latch was the simple hook and eye type. Nothing he couldn't lift with a knife blade through the gap. He worked it slowly, silently. "Where is Walker?" Amos said inside. "Gone," Clara said. "He left yesterday." "Gone where?" "He didn't tell me. He's not the kind of man who explains himself." A sound, a chair scraping, Amos moving closer. "You've had about 3 days to think, Clara. I want to know what you think you're going to do. Go to the law with what? A woman's word against mine, and 2 witnesses who'll say whatever I pay them to say." A pause. "I've built things here. Careful, patient things. And you are not going to walk into a land office with your memorized numbers and undo them." "Why not?" Clara said. The simplicity of the question seemed to stop him. Because it works," Clara said, and her voice had changed. It had the clarity of someone who has decided to stop performing and just be what they are. "It works, and you know it works, and that's what frightens you, not me. The proof." A beat. "Which exists." Silence. "What proof?" Amos said. Very quiet now. "The ledger," she said. "The claim copies. The letters you wrote to the land office man with your name on them, asking him to process filings for deceased claimants." The silence after that was the kind that precedes a very specific kind of violence. The shutter latch gave. Caleb came through the window. He was on his feet inside the cabin in one motion, gun drawn and leveled, and what he saw in the half-second of assessment was this. Amos, standing 6 feet from Clara, turned now toward the window, surprise collapsing his face. Clara standing between the table and the fireplace with the revolver he'd left her aimed at Amos's back, now at his side with both hands steady and her eyes clear and her feet planted. She had him. She'd had him before Caleb came through the window. Caleb had just made it 2 against 1. "I have the ledger," Caleb said. "And the copies. They're not here. They're with someone who'll ride to Harrow City if I don't show up in 2 days. He watched Amos's face work through several calculations in rapid succession. "So shooting either of us creates more problems than it solves." Amos looked at him, looked at the gun, looked at Clara, looked at her gun. She would have shot you, Caleb said. You should know that. I know, Amos said. And for the first time the bluster was gone, and what was left was something flat and stripped down and very tired. I know she would have. Clara didn't lower the revolver. Sit down, she said. On the floor. Both hands where I can see them. Amos looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down. Caleb moved to Clara's side, and they stood together in that one-room cabin at the top of a summer ridge with Amos Greer sitting on the floor between them, and the sun was coming through the window now early and gold and completely indifferent to any of it. Now, Clara said, her voice absolutely level, we're going to talk about what happens next. And you're going to listen very carefully, because what happens next is the only thing between you and a federal courthouse. Her hands didn't shake. Not once. Caleb looked at her. He'd been right about the iron spine. He'd undercounted it. Amos Greer sat on the floor of Caleb Walker's cabin and looked like a man who had spent 40 years building something and was only now beginning to understand how quickly it could be taken apart. Clara kept the revolver level. She didn't pace. She didn't lecture. She just stood there with both hands steady and her eyes on him, and the stillness of her was more intimidating than any shouting would have been, because shouting gives a man something to push against, and her stillness gave him nothing. Caleb moved to the door, lifted the bar, checked outside. Empty trail. No Silas yet. He pulled the door mostly closed and came back to stand at Clara's left, close enough to coordinate, but not so close he crowded her angle. Here's what I know, Clara said. She wasn't performing. Her voice was flat and factual, and all the more dangerous for it. 12 land claims filed under dead men's names along the Southwater Corridor. Plot numbers. I can recite from memory right now if you'd like to test me. Your handwriting on the copies. Your name in 3 letters to the Harrow City Land Office, and a ledger that shows payments to a man named Gerald Fitch, who is, unless I'm mistaken, the assistant registrar at that same office. Amos said nothing. Gerald Fitch is the kind of man, Clara continued, who will absolutely give you up the moment a federal marshal sits him down and explains his options. You know that. You've always known that. It's why you've paid him so carefully and so often, because you know he's not loyal, he's just bought. And bought men have a price for going the other direction too. Something shifted in Amos's face. Not guilt men like Amos didn't carry guilt the way other men did. It was more like the recalibration of someone who has just discovered the ground beneath them is less solid than they thought. What do you want? He said. The bluster was gone. What was left was transactional and tired. I want you to write something down, Clara said. Right now, a full account. The names you used, the claims you filed, Fitch's involvement, Silas's involvement. Everything. She paused. And I want you to sign it. Amos looked at her like she'd suggested he jump off the ridge. That's a confession. Yes, she said. It is. Why in God's name would I? Because the alternative, Clara said, is that we ride to Harrow City with the ledger and the copies and my testimony, and you have no say in how any of it gets framed. A confession gives you some control over the story. It gives you the chance to say you cooperated. She held his gaze. It's the difference between a man who got caught and a man who came clean. Judges notice that difference. Juries notice it more. Amos looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He just looked back. She's right, Caleb said finally. I've sat in enough courtrooms to know she's right. Another silence, long and heavy. Amos looked at his hands on his knees. He looked at the floor. He looked like a man doing the arithmetic of his own life and not liking the sum. Paper, he said, and something to write with. Clara didn't react with satisfaction. She just turned to the shelf behind her, took the small journal Caleb kept for supply lists, opened it to a blank page, and laid it on the table with the pencil beside it. There, she said. Amos got up off the floor with the effort of a man 10 years older than he'd been that morning and sat in the chair at the table. He picked up the pencil. He held it over the page for a moment. If I do this, he said, Silas is going to know it was me. Silas is going to know regardless, Clara said. The question is whether you're ahead of it or behind it. Amos started writing. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding and moved to the window to watch the trail. The morning was fully up now, the light coming hard and flat off the ridge, and the eastern trail was still empty. Silas was a day back, maybe less, if he'd pushed his horse through the night. Maybe more, if he'd had trouble in Oakhaven. He looked at Clara. She was watching Amos write with the focused attention of someone proctoring an exam, close enough to read, far enough to maintain the authority of the gun. She was something. He turned back to the window. The writing took 20 minutes. Amos was thorough, more thorough than Caleb had expected, which suggested the man had been carrying this weight long enough that setting it down had its own grim relief. When he was done, he pushed the journal across the table without being asked and sat back and looked at his hands. Clara read it. She read every word, and Caleb watched her face as she did and saw nothing in it except the precise movement of someone checking work. When she was done, she turned to the last page and said, "Sign it, date it." Amos signed it, dated it. Clara closed the journal and held it against her chest for a moment. Just a moment. Then she set it on the shelf with the ledger and the claim copies and turned back around. "Now," she said, "we need to talk about Silas." Because Silas was the part of the problem that wasn't solved. Amos had signed a confession. Amos had given them the ledger. Amos was sitting in a chair in a mountain cabin, looking like a man who'd already accepted his season was over. But Silas Holt was somewhere on the trail below, armed and moving, and Silas didn't have the particular vulnerability of something to lose that had made Amos cooperative. Silas had always been the simpler kind of dangerous, the kind that operated on payment and proximity, and didn't carry the moral weight of ambition. He was a tool, not an architect. And tools, when they felt the hand that held them slipping, got unpredictable. "Silas won't negotiate," Caleb said. "No," Amos agreed from the chair. It was strange hearing him agree, like a different frequency. "Silas doesn't negotiate. He solves problems the direct way." "How far behind you is he?" Caleb said. Amos thought. "Half a day, maybe. I pushed ahead when we found your tracks on the upper trail. Silas was dealing with the horses." He paused. "He'll have found the cabin by now." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He knows where it is. He's been on this ridge before," Amos said. "Not up here, but close." Clara set the revolver on the table, not putting it down exactly, more, placing it where she could reach it in one motion while her hands were free, and turned to Caleb. "We can't wait for him to arrive," she said. "We need to move. Take Amos with us. Take the documents, ride south to Harrow City before Silas can cut us off." "One horse," Caleb said. "Amos came on a horse." "Where?" Caleb looked at Amos. "Bottom of the upper trail," Amos said. "Tied her in the pines." Caleb turned to Clara. "2 horses, 3 people." "I'll ride with you," she said without hesitation, and the practicality of it was so complete that it closed off any other conversation. They moved fast. Caleb tied Amos's wrists in front of him, not behind, because a man with his hands behind him can't control a horse. And a runaway horse on the upper trail was a problem nobody needed using a length of rope from the supply shelf. Clara packed the documents into the saddlebag Caleb had brought back from Oakhaven, wrapped in the oilskin that kept his supply lists dry. She did it efficiently and without being told. "Water," she said when she was done. "In the bags." "Food. Enough for the ride." She nodded. She took one look around the cabin, a single sweeping look, the kind that takes inventory and says goodbye at the same time, and walked out the door. Caleb was right behind her. They collected Amos's horse from the pines at the top of the upper trail, a sturdy roan that stood quiet when Amos approached. Caleb checked the roan's saddlebag, no weapons, which was either reassuring or suspicious. He settled on reassuring and helped Amos mount with his bound wrists. Then he mounted his own horse, and Clara put her foot in the stirrup he'd vacated and swung up behind him, without asking for assistance, and her arms went around his waist with the practical grip of someone who has ridden double before and knows it's not romantic, it's just physics. They went south. For the first hour, no one spoke. Caleb navigated the trail and listened to everything outside the sound of the horses, and Clara held on behind him, and he could feel the tension in her arms. Not fear exactly, more like the constant readiness of someone who has been braced for the next thing so long that relaxing feels like a trap. Amos rode, a head on the roan wrists, tied back straight, cooperating with the specific dignity of a man who has decided that if he's going down on his own terms. Then around a long curve in the South Trail, Caleb pulled up. Clara felt him stop and her grip tightened. "What?" "Rider," he said, low. "Ahead, single horse, standing still." They couldn't see anything yet. But the horse had flicked its ears and shifted its weight in the way horses do when they smell another horse that isn't moving. Amos half-turned in his saddle. "Silas," he said, and his voice had gone flat. "He took the South Trail to cut us off. I should have thought of that." "You should have," Caleb said. "What do we do?" Clara said against his shoulder low. Caleb thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Clara, take the reins," he said. "What?" "Take the reins. Hold the horse here." He was already swinging down. "If you hear shooting and I don't come back inside 2 minutes, you turn around and go back to the cabin, and you bar the door and you wait. Someone will come looking eventually." "That's not a plan," she said. "It's the plan I have," he said. "Take the reins." She took them. He could hear her not arguing, and he understood that it cost her something significant. He moved up the trail on foot, staying to the tree line quiet, in the way that 6 years of mountain living made a man quiet. Not sneaking exactly, just choosing where to put his feet, with a deliberateness that produced silence as a natural outcome. He came around the curve in the trail with his hand on his gun and his eyes scanning ahead. Silas was there. He was sitting his horse in the middle of the South Trail, with his rifle across his saddle, and he was watching the bend like a man who has set a trap and is waiting to see what walks into it. He was 40 yards away. His eyes found Caleb at 30. "Walker," he said. "Figured you'd come this way." "Silas," Caleb said. He kept walking toward him. Steady pace, hand near but not on the gun. "Where's Amos?" "Behind me," Caleb said. Something moved through Silas's face. Alive and talking," Caleb said. "He's been talking for about an hour. You'd be surprised how much he has to say." The rifle shifted slightly on the saddle, not pointed yet, but considering it. "Don't," Caleb said, and his voice was very quiet. "Think it through first. Amos has already signed a written account. The documents are with a woman on a horse 50 yards back. If you shoot me, those documents still get to Harrow City. If you shoot her too, someone finds them in the saddlebag, and a dead woman and a dead man on a ridge trail, and that's a federal case before the week is out." He stopped walking at 20 yards and stood still. "Only way this ends clean for you, Silas, is if you ride away right now and don't stop riding." Silas looked at him. The pale eyes were working, calculating, doing the same math Amos had done on the cabin floor an hour ago. "Amos signed a confession," Silas said flatly. "He did. He put my name in it." "He did," Caleb said again. "But a confession from a man under duress has less legal weight than testimony from a cooperating witness. If you come in voluntarily and give a statement, you're ahead of Amos, not behind him." He paused. "That's the law. I used to work in it." Silas stared at him for a long moment. Then something went out of him. Not like surrender, more like a decision made with the specific weariness of someone who has been running from one version of this moment for years and has finally gotten tired enough to stop. The rifle went back across the saddle, pointed nowhere. "I'm not riding to any marshal's office with my hands tied," Silas said. "I didn't say you were," Caleb said. "I said you were coming voluntarily." A pause. "And if I run instead?" "Then you run," Caleb said. "And I can't stop you from here. But Amos's written account has your name on every page, and federal marshals have longer memories than you might hope." Silas looked at him, looked past him at the trail curve, looked at the sky, which had nothing to offer on the subject. Then he looked back at Caleb, and something in the pale eyes made a decision that the rest of his face hadn't caught up to yet. "I'll ride in," Silas said. "On my own terms." "Fair enough," Caleb said. He turned and walked back around the curve to where Clara sat on the horse with Amos's roan beside her, and the reins held in both hands, and her eyes fixed on the spot where he'd disappeared. When he came back around the bend, she let out a breath so controlled it was almost not a breath at all. "Silas is coming in," Caleb said. She looked at him. "How?" "I talked to him," Caleb said. "That's all. That's all." She studied his face for a moment. "You're not going to tell me what you said." "I told him the truth," Caleb said. "Works more often than people think." Something moved across her face. Relief and something warmer underneath it, and underneath that something she wasn't naming yet. "All right," she said. "Let's go." The ride to Harrow City took the rest of that day, and most of the next 4 riders on 2 horses moving south through the summer heat, with the documents in the saddlebag, and the confession in the oilskin, and a silence between them that was less tense than it had been on any of the days prior. Even Amos was quiet in a different way, not strategically quiet, not biding his time quiet, settled quiet. A man who has made his decision and is living inside it. Silas rode behind alone on his horse not bound. He didn't try to run. Caleb had been right about that. The man was tired. Tired of running calculations, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of the particular exhaustion of doing bad things carefully. Voluntary surrender was in its way a rest. Clara rode behind Caleb for the first leg, then moved to ride beside him when the trail widened, and they talked not about Amos or Silas or the land claims or any of the things that had occupied the last 5 days. They talked about smaller things, the names of the ridge peaks, the way the summer heat changed when you came down off elevation, whether a hotel kitchen in Kansas City was significantly different from a cook fire on a mountain trail, and in what specific ways. She had opinions about all of it. Strong ones delivered without apology, and he found he was deeply interested in every single one. "You'll go back to cooking," he said. Not a question. She thought about it. "Somewhere," she said. "Somewhere that's mine, not someone else's kitchen." A pause. "A small place. I've thought about it for a long time." "You'd be good at it," he said. "I know," she said without false modesty, and he nearly smiled. "Where?" he said. She looked at the trail ahead of them. "Somewhere that needs it. Somewhere that doesn't have one yet." Another pause. "Somewhere quiet." He thought about that for a while. They reached Harrow City in the late afternoon of the second day. It was bigger than Oak Haven by a factor of 10, a real town with a federal land office and a marshal's post and 3 hotels, and the kind of settled permanence that Oak Haven had always been pretending to. Caleb led them directly to the marshal's office because he knew where it was from his deputy years, and because walking in the front door with voluntary participants was always cleaner than the alternatives. The marshal, a short, careful man named Aldous Webb, who had the eyes of someone who has heard every possible story and is still waiting to be surprised, listened without interrupting for nearly 40 minutes, while Clara laid out the land claim scheme with the precision of a woman reciting something she has had memorized for months. She gave names, dates, plot numbers, the amounts in the ledger, the content of the 3 letters. She gave it all clean and exact and without emotional performance. And Marshal Webb sat across from her and wrote it all down and did not look at Caleb once, because Clara was clearly the one talking and she was clearly the one who knew. When she was done, he looked at her for a long moment. "You memorized all of that," he said, "while you were working for this man." "Yes," she said. "In case you ever got out." "Yes," she said. Webb looked at Caleb then briefly. "And you brought her out?" "She got herself out," Caleb said. "I just paid the bill." Clara looked at him sideways when he said that, and he kept his eyes on the marshal, and the thing between them in that moment was something neither of them addressed directly, because the marshal's office was not the place for it, and also because neither of them were people who addressed things directly in front of witnesses. Webb took the ledger and the claim copies and the confession and signed a receipt for all of it. He put Amos and Silas in separate rooms for formal statements and sent a rider to the land office before dark. He told Clara she would need to stay available for formal testimony, which could mean staying in Harrow City for several weeks. She said she understood. Webb looked at Caleb. "You staying too?" Caleb opened his mouth. "He is," Clara said. "For a few days at least." Caleb closed his mouth. Webb nodded, wrote something in his ledger, and showed them out. On the porch of the marshal's office in the cooling late afternoon air, Clara stood beside Caleb and looked at Harrow City's main street with the particular expression of someone who has just put down something very heavy and is still figuring out what to do with their hands. "You could have let me answer," Caleb said. "You were going to say no," she said. He was quiet. "You were," she said. "I know what that look means." "What look?" "The one where you've decided something is not your business anymore, so you're going to excuse yourself quietly and go back up a mountain." She said it without heat, just observation. "I've been watching you make that face since Oak Haven." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You don't have to stay because of me," she said. "But don't leave because you think you've discharged some obligation. That's not—" She stopped. "That's not what this is." "What is it?" he said. Quiet. Careful. She turned and faced him directly, the way she'd faced every difficult thing since he'd first seen her in that trading post with her feet planted and her eyes clear and the iron spine that hadn't bent under any of it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I know it's not finished." The street moved around them. A wagon passed. Someone called out to someone else down the block. The ordinary machinery of a functioning town went on in every direction, completely indifferent. Caleb looked at Clara Harper with her worn dress and her healing forearms, and her impossible memory, and her gun-steady hands, and her conviction that a thing worth doing was worth doing without asking for permission, or comfort, or acknowledgement of the cost. "A few days," he said. She nodded. Not triumphant. Something warmer and more careful than that. "A few days," she agreed. He looked back at the street. Somewhere in that town was a federal land office that would be very busy for the next several weeks. Somewhere was a confession with Amos Greer's signature drying on it, and a ledger that would unravel 3 years of patient theft. Somewhere on a ridge to the north was a cabin that didn't know it was temporarily empty, and a fire that had gone cold, and 2 chairs at a table that had been sat in by people who were still figuring out what they were to each other. He had a few days. It wasn't much. It was a start. The few days turned into a week before either of them said anything about it. Harrow City moved at a different pace than a ridge cabin or an Oak Haven trading post. It had the particular rhythm of a place where official things happened slowly and unofficial things happened fast, and the land claim case was both at once. Marshal Webb moved quickly on the arrests, bringing in Gerald Fitch from the land office within the first 48 hours, and Fitch folded exactly the way Clara had predicted he would, completely immediately, with the specific relief of a man who has been dreading this conversation for 3 years and is almost grateful it has finally arrived. That was the first twist nobody had planned for. Fitch didn't just confirm the 12 claims Clara had memorized. He gave them 7 more. Claims filed under a different scheme. Older, predating Amos's railroad speculation by 2 years, involving a 4th man, a county judge named Harlan Pruitt, who had been processing land disputes along the South Corridor and consistently ruling in favor of whoever paid him most efficiently. The case that had started as 12 forged homestead claims became something significantly larger, and Marshal Webb, who had the eyes of a man waiting to be surprised, finally looked surprised. Clara sat in the marshal's office on the 3rd morning and listened to Fitch's expanded testimony with the focused stillness of someone cross-checking it against what she already knew, and twice she stopped him to correct a date or a plot number, and both times she was right. Webb looked at Caleb after the second correction. Caleb shrugged. "She memorized them," he said. "I can see that," Webb said. Caleb was staying at the Harrow City Hotel, a narrow room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked west toward the ridge country. He could see the ridge line from that window on clear mornings, a dark edge against the pale sky, and he found himself looking at it the way a man looks at something he isn't sure he's going back to. Clara had the room next door. He knew this because he could hear her moving in the mornings before first light, the same early rising she'd had on the trail, the same refusal to waste the quiet hours. He never knocked. She never knocked. But occasionally they met in the narrow hallway going down to breakfast, and those mornings had a particular quality that neither of them had named. On the 4th day, she came and knocked on his door. He opened it. She was dressed and composed, but something in her face was working at a speed he'd learned to recognize the internal processing that preceded a decision she'd already made, but hadn't yet said out loud. "Fitch named Judge Pruitt this morning," she said. "I heard. Pruitt has land, significant land, 3 plots in the South Corridor that he acquired through his own rulings." She paused. "One of those plots borders a water source, the only reliable year-round water source in that section of the valley." Caleb looked at her. "Clara, there are families," she said, "homesteaders, 6 of them, maybe more, who lost land or water rights through Pruitt's rulings in the last 4 years. They're still there dry farming on bad ground, paying inflated rates to access water they should legally own." Her voice was steady, but underneath it was something that had been building since the beginning, since the trading post, since the moment she'd looked up from the floor and started calculating. If Pruitt is removed and his fraudulent rulings are overturned, those families get their land back. "That's a federal process," Caleb said. "It takes time." "I know that," she said. "But someone needs to file on behalf of those families. Someone who knows land law and has standing to submit the petition." She met his gaze. "Webb told me this morning that there's a land attorney in Harrow City, a woman actually, name of Ruth Calder. She handles homestead claims." "You've already talked to her," Caleb said. Not a question. Clara paused for exactly 1 second. "I have an appointment this afternoon." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not just testifying," he said. "You're building a case." "I'm finishing what I started," she said. "When I memorized those numbers in Amos's office, I wasn't just planning an escape. I was planning this. I just didn't know yet who was going to help me do it." The silence between them had the specific quality of something shifting into place. "What do you need from me?" he said. She held his gaze. "Come with me to the appointment," she said. "Ruth Calder is competent, but she doesn't know this terrain or these trails. You do. And your testimony about what Amos told you about the railroad timeline, the land values, the scheme corroborates everything I have." He picked up his hat from the chair by the door. "What time?" he said. Something moved through her face, quick and warm, and immediately disciplined back to its usual composure. 2 o'clock, she said. He nodded. "I'll meet you downstairs at 1:45. She turned and went back to her room, and he stood in his doorway for a moment, looking at the place in the hallway where she'd been standing. A woman who had walked into a trading post as property and walked out as a witness had spent the intervening week turning her testimony into a legal instrument sharp enough to give 6 families back their water rights. He closed his door and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the ridge and the cabin and the 2 chairs at the table. He thought about them for a long time. Ruth Calder's office was on the 2nd floor of a building that also housed an assay office and a notary. And Ruth Calder herself was a small, precise woman of about 50, with gray-streaked hair, and the particular manner of someone who has spent decades being underestimated and has long since stopped noticing or caring. She shook Clara's hand first, then Caleb's, and sat down and opened a file and said, "Tell me everything, and don't leave out the parts you think don't matter, because in my experience, those are exactly the parts that do." Clara told her everything. It took 2 hours. Ruth Calder asked sharp questions, the kind that came from someone who knew exactly where the weak points in a land case were and was testing for them. And Clara answered all of them and pushed back twice on points where she thought Calder's interpretation of the evidence was too conservative. Calder looked at her the second time she pushed back. "You've read land statutes," Calder said. "I taught myself," Clara said. "In Amos's office. He had a copy of the federal homestead regulations. He kept it to know what he was violating." Calder looked at Caleb. He spread his hand slightly. She looked back at Clara, and something in her professional composure warmed by about 3 degrees. "All right," she said. "Here's what we can do." What they could do was, it turned out, significant. With Fitch's expanded testimony and Clara's memorized record and Calder's knowledge of the legal mechanism for overturning fraudulent rulings, there was a viable petition for the reinstatement of 6 separate homestead claims. It would take time, federal processes always did, but the framework was there. The evidence was there. The will to pursue it was clearly there in the person of Clara Harper, who was sitting across from a land attorney in a second-floor office and dismantling a 3-year fraud scheme with the same flat, precise efficiency she brought to everything else. "You'd need to stay in Harrow City for the duration," Calder said to Clara. "At minimum until the federal review is opened, which could be 6 to 8 weeks. "I understand," Clara said. "And after that you'd need to be available for follow-up proceedings. It could be months." "I'm aware," Clara said. Calder paused. "Miss Harper, I want to be direct with you. What you're proposing to do, putting your name on a petition that directly challenges a sitting judge and a man with Amos Greer's connections, it carries risk, even with him in custody. He has friends." "I know he does," Clara said. "I cleaned their names out of his ledger, too." A pause. Then Ruth Calder smiled small, fast, real. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. "I'll have the initial filing ready in 10 days. They shook hands and walked out into the afternoon, and Harrow City Street was doing its ordinary business around them, and Caleb walked beside Clara, and neither of them spoke for half a block. Then Clara said, "You're going back to the Ridge." It wasn't a question. It had the tone of something she'd been sitting with for days and had finally decided to say out loud instead of carrying alone. He stopped walking. She stopped a half step later and turned to face him. "I need to," he said. "The horse is at the livery. The cabin needs—" He stopped, hurt himself, started again. 6 years is a long time to leave a place unattended. "It's been 10 days, she said. "The cabin is a cabin," she said. "It will be fine." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the gray-green eyes at their most direct, and underneath the directness was something that wasn't calculation this time, something that didn't have the controlled precision of her usual interior landscape, something less managed, something real. "I don't know how to do this," he said. Quiet, honest, the kind of honesty that costs something. "I know," she said. "I don't either." "That's not reassuring." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause. "But I know how to learn things. And you—" She stopped. Looked at the street. Looked back at him. "You paid $20 for a principal and carried it 60 miles. That's not a man who doesn't know how to commit to something." He stood there in the middle of Harrow City's afternoon, with the ridge country visible on the northern horizon, and the woman who had walked out of the worst year of her life, carrying a complete record of someone else's crimes in her memory, and immediately started using it to help strangers, and felt something in his chest do the thing it had been doing for 10 days and getting harder to ignore. "The case is going to take months," he said. "Yes." "You'll be here." "Yes." "I could—" He stopped, worked through it. "I could come back, once I've settled the cabin, make sure it's not going to fall down over the winter." He paused. "There are things that need doing before cold weather." She looked at him for a moment. "And after you've done them," she said carefully. He held her gaze. "After," he said, "I'd need somewhere to be while I figure out what comes next." "Harrow City has a hotel," she said. Her voice was even, giving him nothing he hadn't offered first. "It does," he said. "The room rate is reasonable," she said. "Is it?" "I've been there 10 days," she said. "I have some expertise on the subject now." He nearly smiled. He stopped it before it arrived, but only barely. "A week," he said. "Maybe 2, to settle the cabin." "I'll be here when you get back," she said. Not a promise, an observation, the kind she made when she was stating a fact she'd already decided on. He nodded. She nodded. And then something happened that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them stopped. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his forearm, the way she might reach out to stop someone from stepping off a curb into traffic. Except there was no curb and no traffic, just her hand on his arm for 3 seconds, and then gone. "Be careful on the upper trail," she said. "The north switchback is loose after rain." "I know that trail," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He looked down at his arm where her hand had been. He looked back up at her. "Clara," he said. "Go," she said, "before you talk yourself out of coming back." He went. The ride north was different from every other ride he'd made on that trail. Different from the ride down to Oak Haven 10 days ago. Different from the ride back with Silas's pale eyes in the rear view and the documents in the saddlebag. Different from all the solitary rides of the 6 years before that. The difference was not in the trail, or the weather, or the horse. It was in the specific awareness of the direction he was pointing away, and the specific awareness of where he was pointing back to, which was no longer only the ridge. He reached the cabin by mid-afternoon on the second day. It was exactly as they'd left it. The bar on the door, the provisions on the shelf, the cold fireplace, the 2 chairs at the table. The narrow bed along the back wall where Clara had slept and where he'd heard her breathing in the dark, and understood for the first time in 6 years that silence and solitude were not the same thing. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went in and built a fire and sat in his chair and thought about what he was actually doing. What he was doing was he recognized deciding something. Not in the dramatic way of a man having a revelation. He'd always been suspicious of dramatic revelations. They tended to be emotion mistaken for insight. This was the quieter kind of deciding. The kind that happens when you sit in a room long enough to hear yourself think, and what you hear is not comfortable and not complicated. It's just true. He had lived on this ridge for 6 years because connection cost something he hadn't been willing to pay. Because caring about a place or a person or a situation created exposure, and exposure created loss. And loss had a specific weight he'd already carried once, and had made a calculation about never carrying again. Clara Harper had walked into his $20, and his principal, and his calculation, and had not asked him to carry anything for her. She had carried her own weight up a 3-day trail with wrapped feet and a straight back, and she had stood in a 1-room cabin with a loaded revolver and held a man at gunpoint long enough for him to come through a window. And then she had stayed in Harrow City and built a case for 6 families she'd never met because she had memorized the proof and could not unknow it, and knowing it without acting on it would have been something she could not have lived with. That was not a woman who would cost him more than he had. That was a woman who was already paying her own way and would expect no different from him. He sat in the chair until the fire burned low. Then he stood up, went to the provision shelf and started sorting what needed to be packed down to Harrow City and what needed to be left behind for the winter. He worked for 2 days. The cabin got what it needed. Checked beams, rechinked walls, the water barrel drained and sealed the provision shelf stocked against the cold. He worked with the methodical satisfaction of a man who is doing a thing properly because it deserves to be done properly, and he moved through the 2 days without hurrying, because hurrying would have meant admitting the impatience he felt, and he wasn't ready to admit it quite yet. On the 3rd day, he packed the saddlebag, barred the cabin door from outside with the crossbar he kept for that purpose, and stood for a moment looking at the place. 6 years. It had been exactly what he'd needed, exactly when he'd needed it. He didn't say goodbye to it. It wasn't the kind of place that required goodbyes. He tied the saddlebag and rode south. He made Harrow City in a day and a half, pushing a little harder than he usually did, and not bothering to pretend he wasn't. He left the horse at the livery. Dort's cousin ran the Harrow City stable, which seemed like more than coincidence, and was probably just the West, and walked up the main street with his saddlebag over his shoulder, and the ridge at his back, and the hotel at the end of the block. He was halfway there when he heard his name. Caleb. He turned. Clara was coming out of Ruth Calder's office building across the street, a folder of papers under her arm and her hair pinned up in the practical way she'd adopted since arriving in Harrow City, and she stopped on the boardwalk and looked at him. He crossed the street. She watched him come without moving. When he reached the boardwalk, she looked at him with the gray-green eyes in their full current operational mode, reading everything, processing fast landing on something that for once she was not disciplining back into neutrality. "You're back," she said. "I said I would be," he said. "You said a week or 2, she said. "It's been 4 days. He stood there with the saddlebag on his shoulder and the afternoon light coming at a low angle, and he said, "I worked fast." She looked at him. "The petition was accepted," she said. "This morning. The Federal Review opens in 3 weeks. Calder says it's strong." "I know it is," he said. "You built it." She shook her head slightly. Not disagreement, more like she wasn't ready to take that cleanly. "We built it," she said. "Your testimony about the railroad timeline was the piece that tied the economic motive to the fraud. Without that, it's just a land scheme. With it, its conspiracy. Your memory, he said. Your numbers, your idea. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. Not because it was complicated, it was simple. The simplest thing she'd ever said to him. I'm glad you came back, she said. Just that. He thought about saying something proportional. Something measured, something that didn't commit too much or too fast. He thought about the 6 years of practiced restraint and the 2 chairs at the table, and the very specific feeling of hearing someone else breathe in the dark after years of silence. I'm not going back, he said. Not the same way. She went still. The cabin's winterized, he said. It'll keep. And there are things here. He stopped. Tried again. There's a federal case that needs a witness. And a woman who's going to be in Harrow City for months, building something for 6 families she's never met. And I don't... He stopped a third time, and this time, he didn't try to make it smooth. I don't want to be on a ridge by myself when all of that is happening 40 miles south. Clara was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, because it was not one she'd shown him. It was unguarded in a way that the gun-steady hands and the iron spine and the precise memory never were. It was the face underneath all of that, younger, less armored, and so thoroughly real that looking at it required something from him that he gave without deciding to. That's the most words you've ever said at once, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. I'm aware, he said. She shifted the folder of papers under her arm. She looked at the street. She looked back at him. She made the decision the way she always made decisions, not impulsively, not reluctantly, but with the clear-eyed commitment of someone who has looked at the evidence and arrived at the only honest conclusion. There's a vacant lot, she said, 2 blocks east of Calder's office. I walked past it this morning. It's the right size for a small building. Close to the main street, but not on it. She paused. The kind of lot that would suit a small restaurant. The kind of town that needs one. He looked at her. The land attorney in this town handles property sales too, she said. Calder mentioned it. Clara, I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you what I'm planning. Because you asked me back at the trading post what I was going to do. She met his gaze. This is what I'm going to do. He looked at the street. He thought about the ridge cabin, cold and sealed, sitting patient and waiting the way good structures do. He thought about Red Hook, about the thing he'd walked away from, and the price of walking away. He thought about $20 and 60 miles of trail, and a woman who had carried 15 land claim numbers in her head through everything Amos Greer had done to her. Not for revenge, not even only for herself, but because she had seen an injustice with the specific clarity of someone who cannot unsee things. I could look at the lot with you, he said, if you want a second opinion. She was quiet for a moment. I'd like that, she said. They walked east together 2 blocks, and the lot was there. Just a lot. Just ground. Just possibility. And they stood looking at it with the afternoons settling around them and the practical consideration of people who have survived harder things than starting something new. Good bones, Caleb said, which was a thing he'd heard builders say, though he'd never said it himself. Good location, Clara said. Close to the marshal's office. Federal witnesses need somewhere to eat. He looked at her. She was looking at the lot. And after the case, he said. After the review. After all of it. After all of it, she said, it will still be here, and so will I. She said it the way she said everything important, without asking for confirmation, without leaving room for interpretation. Just a statement of what was true. He stood beside her on a vacant lot in Harrow City, with the ridge at his back, and 6 years of deliberate solitude behind him, and the very clear understanding that solitude had never been what he actually wanted. It had been what he'd settled for when wanting felt too costly. It didn't feel costly anymore. It felt like the most reasonable thing he'd done in years. I'll need to find somewhere to stay, he said, if I'm going to be here a while. The hotel is on the next block, she said. Room rate is reasonable. I have expertise on the subject. You mentioned, he said. She almost smiled. He saw it, that particular almost, and this time he didn't stop his own. I didn't say anything else. Neither did she. They stood on the lot in the afternoon light, Two people who had both been through the kind of things that teach you the difference between what you can survive alone and what you shouldn't have to. And they looked at the ground that might become something, and the street that already was something, and the life that was assembling itself out of the evidence they'd both been gathering without knowing it. Caleb Walker had ridden into Oak Haven for salt and beans. He had come out of it with something he hadn't budgeted for, and couldn't have planned, and wouldn't have traded for anything the Ridge had ever given him. And Clara Harper, who had stood on a trading post floor, with her eyes fixed on a spot 3 feet in front of her boots, and already knew every number she needed to bring a 3-year fraud to justice, had walked out of the worst year of her life. Not because someone had rescued her, but because she had decided to leave and had simply been waiting for a man principled enough to open the door. She had found one. He had found her. And in Harrow City, on a Tuesday afternoon, on a vacant lot, 2 blocks from a land attorney's office, they began carefully, practically, and without any fanfare whatsoever, to build something that would last.